This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Support for Hot Take comes from the Southern Environmental Law Center and its podcast, Broken Ground, with the latest season focusing on the story of how a Black community on the outskirts of Memphis came together to beat the odds and defeat a crude oil pipeline. Here, people hailing from all corners of the city and beyond joined together to fight the environmental injustices and threats posed by the controversial Byhalia pipeline. Listen to their story, now available wherever you get your podcasts. Hey, Hotcakes, it's Mary. I just wanted to come in with a quick update about events on the ground in Jackson, Mississippi and in Pakistan. We recorded this week's episode on Monday, and, well, things have changed a bit since then, so we wanted to come in with new information and ways that you can help. So on Monday, after a summer of unprecedented rain, Jackson, Mississippi faced some serious flooding threats from the Pearl River. And while the city might have avoided the worst of the floodwaters, the flood did take out a major water treatment plant, and it left the majority Black city of about 150,000 people without running water. Now, that means no water to drink, no water to bathe in, no water to brush your teeth with. This is life-threatening stuff, and it's a chronic problem, and it was decades in the making. So this is what happens when climate change plays out on top of systemic environmental racism. And of course, climate change is the ultimate result of environmental racism. And we're going to talk more about that on next week's show. So while the city has made improvements, people are still in dire straits. And this is a chronic problem that is going to take big investments to fix. To that end, if you are able, I urge you to donate to the Mississippi Rapid Response Coalition, which is aiming to raise the funds for a long-term solution. You can also donate to Cooperation Jackson, which is doing great work on the ground pretty much all the time and is doing water aid work right now. The links to donate are in our show notes. This is personal to me as a Mississippian, and I want to remind folks that this Democratic Party that everyone is always being asked to vote for, if they want any kind of human rights, it was molded by Black Southerners, especially Black Mississippians. We would not have half the democracy that we have today if it were not for them. They need you now. Show up. In Pakistan, the floods were ignited by what the United Nations officials have called monsoons on steroids, which brought the heaviest rain in living human memory. Pakistan is home to the world's hottest city so far, and now that city is underwater. In fact, the floods have been so powerful, they've created a 100-kilometer inland lake. The death toll is over 1,100, and more than 3,500 have been injured, and more than 33 million have been affected. A third of the country is underwater. And while there's been some talk about the incompetence of the Pakistani government contributing to the chaos, I want to underscore what Amy said in this week's recording. Pakistan is responsible for less than 1% of global warming pollution. So if you're someone in the global north, the government incompetence in Pakistan is frankly none of your business, and we need to rally around helping the people of Pakistan who absolutely do not deserve what is happening to them. No one does. In our show notes, we have links to 3 fundraisers that we trust. Please go to the show notes and donate. Please help people.
Hey, Hotcakes. Welcome to Hot Take. I'm Amy Westervelt.
And I'm Mary Anise Hegler. We are talking on the 17th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina and the first anniversary of Hurricane Ida. So it's a pretty somber day, especially if you're in the Gulf South. But honestly, I feel like today should just be a day of mourning and remembrance. It should just be a paid day off. I'm sorry. I really do think that. Mm-hmm. And it's also on a day where Jackson, Mississippi is flooding. I just read that the worst expectations of the flood were averted, but it's still pretty serious. And I think that's pretty important to remember because Mississippi is often written out of the Katrina story. So, yeah, my heart is with Jackson today as much as it is with New Orleans and the victims of Katrina and Ida.
Yeah. I was reading a story earlier. The headline on CNN was just, "Get out now. Mayor urges residents to flee ahead of rising river waters in Mississippi." And I was like, oh no.
And the thing is, Jackson is not on the Mississippi River, right? Like I think when people think of Mississippi flooding, they think of the Mississippi River because it's such a huge river. But this is the Pearl River, which feeds into the Mississippi River and can definitely flood. But yeah, just a little bit of geography for folks who aren't familiar.
Yeah. We're also talking in the aftermath of record-setting monsoons in Pakistan that have displaced hundreds of thousands of people and killed over 1,000.
Wow.
With the death toll still rising. It's very, very scary and will absolutely lead to a major refugee crisis.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people forget about this because I feel like anytime we're talking about Pakistan, it's because of the heat there. But Pakistan is second only to Antarctica in the number of glaciers that it has.
What?
And a big part... Yes. And a big part of the flooding that we're seeing is not just this huge monsoon that hit, but also the fact that you had such severe glacial melting because of the heat wave earlier this summer. So again, these compounding crises just layered on top of each other.
I am learning that in this moment right now.
Isn't that crazy? I know. Yeah. Yes.
I just don't think of glaciers and the equator as being in the same place.
Yeah.
But that goes to show what I know. And also there's the heat wave in China. It's the worst heat wave ever in human history.
Over 70 days. That is insane. I just am like, and it was one of those things where there was not a lot of media coverage happening. Some folks are saying that's because the government in China was trying to sort of keep a lid on it. And the story of the heat wave kind of got broken by meteorologists who were just looking at satellites going like, has anyone noticed that China's like on fire? It's just several days, months now of extreme heat. It's
Sure, they might have a bigger carbon footprint now, but look at what's happening to them right now. It's not the result of their carbon footprint. And I know Pakistan and India are very different countries. I don't mean to lump them together, but what's happening in the Indian subcontinent, what's happening in China is the result of the Industrial Revolution and of Europe America. It is not the result of their carbon footprint.
Correct.
So
that is correct. Yeah, just to put it in perspective, Pakistan responsible for less than 1% of emissions. So this is kind of what we're talking about in today's episode, actually, is this problem of colonialism, and especially as it intersects with climate.
And meanwhile, the hurricane season is ramping up too. They're predicting storms this weekend. Wait, is that true?
That's true in the Atlantic. Yes. I'm sorry to tell you.
And meanwhile, the hurricane season is entering, the high anxiety period. The Gulf still hasn't recovered from Katrina, let alone Ida and all the other storms in between because, climate sacrifice zones exist in the U.S. too. And today we're going to talk about how that happened in the first place. We're going to be talking about climate colonialism.
That's right. And I think we're both super, super excited about our guest today, investigative journalist Abram Lustgarten. He works with ProPublica and the New York Times, and he just did a really awesome story where he profiled the Barbadian prime minister and her quest to get a handle on the debt that colonialism has imposed on Barbados, especially as they brace for further climate impacts, which are imminent.
Absolutely. And just a little a warning to our listeners. The first half of this episode is definitely going to be Amy gushing over how he was able to synthesize so much information into really compelling
so impressive.
Prose. See?
It's so impressive.
Told you.
I'm so impressed.
Told
yes.
You. She's going to fangirl, and she's going to fangirl hard. But also, the story is really amazing, and I really recommend that all of our listeners go out and read it. It's really thorough, and there's definitely no way we're going to get to everything that he covered in the story, but we might try.
That's right. So with that, we're excited to get this conversation started, and I think it's time.
It's time to talk about climate.
Abram Lustgarten, welcome to Hot Take. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Hey, Fidelity. How can I remember to invest every month?
With the Fidelity app, you can choose a schedule and set up recurring investments in stocks and ETFs.
Oh, that sounds easier than I thought.
You got this.
Yeah, I do. Now, where did I put my keys?
You will find them where you left them.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
Okay, before we get started on anything else, I have to just say, how did you take all that information and synthesize it into one good story? I'm so jealous. Such a master of your craft, sir. That Barbados story was amazing.
She's going to do this for a lot, Abram. She's going to do
You're
it a
too
lot.
kind. The key is to take twice as much time as your editors allow you to.
How long did it take, actually? Because that story is really thorough, and we're going to get into the details. But just as a writer, I don't know how many interviews you did, how many trips you took, how much research you did, and then to put it into a story. How long did it take?
So I probably shouldn't admit this publicly. That story took almost a year to complete, but for lots of complex reasons that weren't all because of the reporting or the journalism. It was a crazy busy time in my life, and then COVID made travel really difficult, and I had a couple trips that were canceled. But the biggest hurdle was, as you're sort of alluding to, trying to wrap my head around the financial side of it, and that was just like studying over again and again until I felt like I understood it enough to build a story off of it, or even do interviews about it, or criticize anybody, let alone, an institution as big as the IMF. So that was just a sort of a painful, repetitive learning process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I'm so glad that you did it, because I think that I keep hearing from a lot of climate folks, the finance sector is the place that everybody should be focusing now. But I think a lot of climate reporters, myself included, and in this too, are a little bit. I've always kind of avoided finance stories for exactly that reason. So
it's a really good reason.
It's a really good reason. Yeah. But I think we all need to do more of it, because it is the thing that, or at least a thing that is very, very much having an influence on all of these policies and impacts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like we're talking about, you did this really impressive story about Barbados and the prime minister's efforts to get the country out of its dual crisis of climate and debt. But while I was reading it, my main question was, and I don't even care if this is a stupid question, is this the same Barbados that just recently left the crown and had Rihanna at the independence ceremony? So I guess, how did Barbados rake up all of that debt while under colonial control? And if so, if you can get that much debt and be part of the British Empire, what's the point of being part of the British Empire?
Well, I think you just summarized the entire story.
Yes.
I no joke, I really did not think I did not know that if you were still under colonial rule that you were responsible for your own debts.
Yeah, so Barbados has been independent for a long time, since the 60s. So it wasn't exactly under colonial rule, but the Queen of England was still the official ruler of Barbados until their recent departure and becoming an independent republic. But even now, they're still a member of the Commonwealth. So they're still a member of the countries that orbit the former British colonial power.
What's the benefit of that, of staying in the Commonwealth?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's I think it's partially a matter of heritage at this point, and the UK is an ally of Barbados. I imagine that there's financial and other government benefits that come with having the UK's support.
Mm-hmm.
I always wonder why so many Commonwealth countries that are totally independent now still have the Queen on their money, and I think it's
I mean, who wants to print new
heritage
money?
thing too? Yeah.
Like Canada.
Yeah. Like Canada, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so your story also talks about how debt and climate change come to this sort of devastating collision. Can you talk a little bit more about that and sort of how that came to be and how it plays out today? How do these two things collide? You can absolutely retread some of the territory that you walked in this Barbados story, because I think it illustrates it so well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all learning quickly that climate change, the impacts of climate change are going to be unbelievably expensive. And they're going to be expensive for countries like the United States, but they're going to be even more expensive for the developing world and for middle income countries, of which, Barbados and the islands of the Caribbean are one of them. And so, for me, this project, it came together from a bunch of different directions at once. But the first was just to look at a part of the world that is so close to the United States, that is so incredibly imperiled by climate change itself. And we think about hurricanes as being the predominant threat for the islands of the Caribbean, and it is an unbelievable threat. But they're also facing rising temperatures and drought and sea level rise and blight of their crops and a loss of fresh water and the salinization of their aquifers, and the list goes on and on. So they're really kind of getting it at all angles, and many of those perils are dramatically as bad or worse as anywhere else on the planet. So they're in a tough situation. And then it also happens that they're in a great amount of debt. The islands of the Caribbean are one of the most indebted group of countries in the world. To take a step back, I've been interested for a long time in the power of the IMF and the World Bank, and how they are supporting, or interfering with all sorts of countries' ability to adapt to climate change. To find the money to pay for the expenses to protect themselves, to build seawalls, to build water treatment plants, to make sure that they have fresh water supplies or underground electrical cabling, or all of the various sort of boring, mundane infrastructure things that can make a country continue to operate in the face of environmental crisis. And so these issues just came together, for me, in looking at the Caribbean: extremely high risk, extremely high levels of debt, and because of the debt and the bankruptcy, that Barbados is just an example of a number of countries that are going through something similar, a real dependence on the IMF and the World Bank to basically allow or disallow their ability to adapt to climate change.
Mm-hmm. One of the more interesting things in the story is how you talked about how arguably that's actually the mission of the IMF and the World Bank, right?
Exactly. I mean, so both institutions were created after World War II in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to basically stabilize the world economy, and to do that by making sure that small countries, big countries, all could sort of depend on each other. There was a little bit of like a collectivization and an insurance type of pooling that would happen, and the countries that were members, and there's 180 or so members, they'd pay dues, and then the collective resources would be used to support those other countries in need. And it's all just meant to kind of stabilize the global economy, because a shock in one place, winds up being a shock in another. But the essence of my reporting was looking at how the IMF especially, and the World Bank could also be a candidate for this criticism, but I happen to focus on the IMF. They've just been slow to recognize that climate change is as much of an economic threat as all the other kinds of economic threats that they always look at and that they exist to prevent. And it's just become a sort of inexplicable contradiction in their mission. And then as they've slowly come around to the idea of it, it's, they haven't developed the muscles to actually address it.
Right.
That's
can
crazy.
can you take another step like way back and just talk a little bit about how a country like Barbados ends up in large amounts of debt in this way in the first place? What are they borrowing to do, and where are they borrowing from?
So Barbados, like a lot of middle and low income countries, takes on enormous debt for a complex set of reasons that are not all as sort of blameless as just being a victim of climate change. There's periods of corruption, really poor management as they've cycled through, various governments over the years, a boondoggle here and there. All of these things have added up, as they have for many poorer countries, to, a fragile to poor fiscal situation. Their economy isn't super strong. In the case of Barbados, the economy is enormously dependent on tourism. Its second great source of income is the banking industry, so offshore banking and trading and financing and incorporating companies in Barbados who don't want to incorporate in the United States, for example. Both of these things dried up substantially during the 2008 financial crisis and then dried up again as COVID hit. So aside from climate change, Barbados was in a real, economic predicament. Over those years, it couldn't balance its budgets. It was paying more to government staff than it was earning in tax revenues. And it would borrow from its own central bank. It would borrow from the IMF and the World Bank. It would borrow from foreign banks and lenders like Citibank or JP Morgan Chase or BlackRock or Credit Suisse in Europe. And it just like any consumer that needs more money, it would take on debt to fund the things that it couldn't pay for without necessarily fixing its balance sheet so that it was using its money more efficiently or could balance that balance sheet in the future. Then you pile on top of that the effect of climate change. For Caribbean countries in particular, a significant amount of the debt of many of those countries, Barbados is actually a little bit of an exception, but countries like Grenada or Dominica or Jamaica, which also have very high debt, it's past hurricanes and disasters that have cost them so much money. So in 2017, Hurricane Maria made a direct hit on the island of Dominica and just wiped the island out. It cleared trees down to stumps and left few buildings standing. And the cost of that in the space of 36 hours was about 226% of that country's GDP. So 2.5 years of its total economic activity. And you imagine, how long it would take to recover from that. So that's kind of an extreme example, but all of these countries have had big environmental hits at one point or another. And because there isn't really a good global financial mechanism to pay for loss and damages in these countries that have disasters, the cost of those disasters just gets piled onto their balance sheet. And if they're already having a difficult time balancing that balance sheet, then they either take on more debt to pay for the cost of those disasters using the same banks and mechanisms that I just described, or best case, they just have a very hard time paying back the debt that they already have. But either way, those disasters are weighing heavily. And then you add on top of that the additional layer of the future costs of climate change and what they need to be prepared to start paying for from this point forward. And there's just, they're in a deep hole. There's almost no way out.
Yeah. I thought you did such a good job in this story of making it relatable to personal debt, in this way that like individuals can wind up with, loans and credit card debt. And then, they're just barely paying the interest rates on those, right? And then maybe they are in a natural disaster themselves and have to evacuate. And it's easy to kind of understand when you think about it in these terms, I think.
Yeah, it's almost the same thing. It's In 2017, when Barbados declared bankruptcy, it was paying 55% of its GDP to service the debt that it owed. And imagine, just like you're an individual, imagine like you want to improve your education system and you wish you had better funding for colleges, and you need to build a new hospital, and you need a new water treatment system, and you're trying to find the money for all of that. But more than half of your entire country's income is just going right back offshore to pay the banks that hold your debt, mostly for interest and some for principal.
Yeah.
Talk about a vicious cycle. So in restructuring the debt, I'm not even sure if that's the right term, the Prime Minister of Barbados tied a hurricane clause to the loan agreements. Can you talk a little bit more about what a hurricane or disaster clause is and how it could change the face of debt at the international level?
Yeah, so there's lots of layers to debt, and there's lots of layers to the kind of relief that countries like Barbados or its Prime Minister Mia Mottley want. And it ranges from like actual forgiveness of debt, just wiping it off the balance sheets, to just a little bit of breathing room. And Mia Mottley calls that fiscal space. And that's basically like a reprieve of a couple of months so that you can use the money that you would pay for debt to address something else that's more of an emergency. And it's to do exactly what I just described. Like you're supposed to pay your money to Citibank, but you really need to fix a water main that's leaking. And you need to be able to take that money from the debt and spend it on the water main without getting in trouble, without losing your credit rating, without your banks going bankrupt or the value of your currency imploding and becoming nothing. So they were just creatively, when they restructured their debt, which is a process of basically negotiating with the whole world to give them a break. They were looking for mechanisms or a creative way to build in some kind of protection for themselves that wasn't just an insurance policy. And insurers, by the way, they don't really want to insure countries like Barbados anymore because there's no amount of insurers ultimately want to make money, and they think that they'll pay out more than they'll take in. So insurance isn't a good mechanism. So Barbados was trying to figure out a different solution, and they came up with, it's actually the second time it's used, but they came up with what was called a hurricane clause, and it's really simple. They sell bonds to foreign investors, and those bonds come with a contract for when and how they're paid out and the interest rate that they're paid out for. And the hurricane clause basically says if there's a major storm and it exceeds a certain threshold, I think for Barbados it was 5% of their GDP or something like that. But for each hurricane clause, there's a threshold. If the disaster exceeds the threshold, then the debt automatically goes into a period of relief. They don't owe payments for a certain amount of time. The banks that are owed the money don't lose the money. It gets tacked on to the end of the period. So if they owed $10 million over 30 years and they owed $1,000 a month in interest on that, which are absurd numbers, but just for the example, they would not have to pay the $1,000, and at the end of the term, it would be 35 years instead of 30, and they would owe, $32 million or something like that. So they still owe the money at the end, but they get a break so that they can use the money up front to address the urgent needs that come up.
Which is smart, because if a hurricane wipes them out, they're not paying anybody any money, right? I mean, it makes financial sense for the lenders too.
Well, that's Mia Mottley's argument. That was precisely what she told the lenders who didn't necessarily want to hear it at first. But she's like, basically, I can go bankrupt and you get nothing and we all suffer, or I can remain at the table and you lose a little bit and I lose a little bit, but we both come out ahead.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Did we already spell out how the debt is so much more severe in the Caribbean?
Why it's so much more severe? Is it more severe than other global South countries?
So, yes. So I can't remember the exact ranking. The debt and the total debt in the Caribbean is among the highest, if not the highest, depending on which country or group of countries you're looking at around the world. Barbados's debt at the time that declared bankruptcy was it? I think it was 165% of GDP or something like that. And that's a ratio that the IMF uses to measure high debt. It wants a nation's debt to be around 60% of its GDP. Barbados's debt was around 165, 170% of its GDP. So there's very few, if any, countries around the world whose debt are that high. But in general, small country debt and small island debt in particular is surging. This year, the International Finance Corporation announced there was something like $54 trillion in privately held debt in small and emerging markets around the world. And the United Nations said that small island debts had doubled between 2008 and 2021. The IMF projected last year that 3/4 of all emerging market economies around the world would pay a third or more of their total tax revenue just in interest on that debt.
Wow. And do you have a sense of how much of that is attributable to climate change? I know that's a hard number to pin down.
A lot. I'm going to guess a lot.
Yeah, so there's it's very difficult to say to pinpoint exactly. And in Barbados, it's a modest proportion. For Barbados, the fear is what happens next, how they pay for the damages to come. For countries like Dominica, it's a much higher proportion because of that huge hit in 2017. Or Grenada, which I looked at as a case study, which sustained Hurricane Ivan in 2004. Also, something like 150% of its GDP was erased in the damages from that storm, and it's carried that debt ever since. There's a great body of research out of the University of West Indies, also in Barbados, that tried to answer that question you just asked and looked at sovereign debt for small island countries around the world. And it couldn't pinpoint the exact, or the researchers didn't pinpoint the exact proportion of debt that's environmentally caused in the Caribbean, but found that the Caribbean situation was different from the economies of other small island states, where many of those other countries in the Pacific, for example, had a real different dynamic. So they had strong, robust, diversified economies and a sustained level of growth that let them both continue to borrow and even while they accumulated debt, they had a better ability to pay for environmental shocks. The Caribbean, because of the frequency of storms, because the costs basically were coming in faster than the damages could get paid off, was unique globally in the degree to which hurricanes were causing the accumulation of that debt.
It's fascinating and terrifying. Yeah. Wow. All right. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about loss and damages in general right after this quick break.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Hey, hotcakes, it's Mary. We are pretty clear on this show that you don't need to understand all the science to care about or even to understand climate change. But at the same time, we understand that you might have a few questions about the climate science. You might have a few curiosities. So we are planning a special mailbag episode where we will go through your scientific questions and more. And you can send those questions to hottake@crooked.com. That's hottake@crooked.com. We're planning to have this episode sometime in September, and we will be inviting on a fantastic climate scientist to help us talk through these things. So again, send your questions to hottake@crookedmedia.com.
Hot Take is brought to you by Blinkist. Blinkist is kind of like the upgraded modern digital version of CliffsNotes. They offer the best selection of nonfiction books, and they pull out key takeaways and put them into 15-minute text and audio explainers called Blinks. It's maybe embarrassing for me to admit, but I have to read so much for work that sometimes I'm like, oh, I want to read this new book, but I don't have time to read the whole thing, but I want to know what's the most important, and I will refer back to Blinks.
Aww.
I also use it for books that I have read, where I'm like, it's just a handy guide to be able to like sort of quickly surface stuff that you know that you read, but you can't remember exactly how folks put it. So like I just did that for the book Dark Money, which is actually one of my favorite books, written by Jane Mayer. She's a reporter at The New Yorker. I also did it recently with the 1619 Project, written by Nicole Hannah-Jones. Both amazing books, but also very thick books.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't remember what page that was, but I know it was in the Blinkist summary. So handy.
Yeah, it's also great if you're like someone who likes to curl up with a novel or some fiction and nonfiction is like a challenge for you. Blinkist is great for you.
Yes, exactly.
I'm talking about me.
Yes. Yeah, it's true. They've condensed over 5,000 titles in 27 categories. And they also produce shortcasts, which are Blinks for podcasts. Thanks to Blinkist, you can access valuable knowledge and great ideas very, very, very quickly. You can get, inspiration, remember things, listen, learn. You can listen and read. It's awesome. You can also actually download titles to access them offline too, so you don't always have to be online to access it. Right now, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Go to Blinkist.com/HT to start your free 7-day trial and get 25% off a Blinkist premium membership. That's Blinkist, spelled Blinkist, Blinkist.com/HT to get 25% off and a 7-day free trial. Blinkist.com/HT. Hot Take is brought to you by Cozy Earth. Hotter weather can mean goodbye to a good night's sleep for some people, unless you're Mary Hegler and you love to sweat yourself to sleep every night.
You're supposed to sweat. It's a natural human function. I don't understand. When did everybody become afraid of their own sweat? What is wrong with y'all?
I don't know. It's hard for me to sleep when I'm sweaty, which is why I actually love the fact that Cozy Earth's bedding kind of cools me off at night. It's super soft and it just makes me a little bit less overheated when I'm going to sleep, which I need. I do.
I'm just saying, I love Cozy Earth sheets too because they feel like butter and they're just like really, really comfortable. But like, what's wrong with your sweat? Does it itch?
No, it just makes me feel like, I don't know. It makes me feel kind of panicky if I'm too sweaty. And
are you sweating because you're panicking?
Maybe.
Is this possible. Nightmare sweat or just like
it's actually night terrors? No, I'm just kidding.
Well then, yeah.
I'm totally kidding. I don't know what it is. I don't know. I just find it hard to sleep. But Cozy Earth is good if you just like soft sheets too.
Yeah,
it's made from it's made from 100% viscose that's made from bamboo, which is awesome because as we've talked about before, bamboo is a sustainable, renewable resource. You can harvest the fibers from the plant without killing it, so it's a great alternative to cotton and other types of fabrics that are not so sustainable. It's now available in 4 natural colors. And they're super, super, breathable, cool, soft. They're awesome. For a limited time, save 35% on Cozy Earth bedding. You can go to cozyearth.com/hot and enter hot at checkout to save 35% right now, all backed by a 100-night trial. That's like half a year.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's not totally, but I'm not good at math.
Yeah. I'm looking at the site right now and they have 5 colors. There's a new charcoal color that I think I want.
Ooh.
So.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. That's cozyearth.com/HOT and be sure to enter hot at checkout too to get that 35% off. Okay, so I actually was working on a story last year about the way that loss and damages shows up in the global climate conversation in general, and Mia Motley was like a big figure in that as well. Like, she is someone who speaks on this at international climate summits quite a bit, and I'm wondering if how much that came up in your conversations with her.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that it comes up, it's part of her whole impassioned package about the unfairness and the enormous inequity.
Yeah.
That countries like Barbados face, but really all indebted and small countries face in the global climate community, in the Paris community, or facing the IMF and facing the World Bank, where they're just essentially unsupported in paying for loss and damages, or paying for infrastructure, or even paying for the mitigation projects that they hope to undertake. And so she is she's delivered this series of fiery speeches and become a really prominent spokesperson on this issue, whether at COP or at the United Nations. And she's the same way in our conversations. This has become just like a burning nugget of frustration deep in her core, the injustice of it all. Even the fact that so many hundreds of millions and billions of dollars have been promised by the United Nations or through the Paris Agreement and still not delivered.
Mm-hmm.
So she will list the many and myriad ways in which Barbados and other small countries have been and continue to be wronged, even as they need so much more than what they're promised. They haven't been given what they've been promised either.
Yeah.
I want to take a quick step back, actually, and talk about what loss and damage actually is. And Amy, I know you've done a lot of research and reporting on that. So I'm actually asking both of you, for folks who are not as familiar, what do you mean when you say loss and damage?
Yeah, well, I'll just put some years on it. So, nice. I'm I like numbers, even though you're not supposed to use them in audio.
I like dates.
But I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I like dates. Yeah. So Vanuatu kind of first brought this up at the very first International Climate Summit, which was the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And the basic premise is, look, global north countries, for the most part, are the countries that have enriched themselves via fossil fuels, and global south countries, for the most part, are the countries that are facing the most severe and most expensive climate impacts. So the idea is that the countries that made money off of this problem should pay into a fund that the countries that are, going to experience the worst of this problem can use to deal with climate adaptation, deal with disaster relief, and deal with transitioning off of fossil fuels, all of which are expensive things to do and hard to do when, like we just talked about in the first segment, you're saddled with a bunch of debt. You're trying to find the money to improve your roads and infrastructure and education and healthcare and all of these things, but you have this enormous amount of debt. And in 2009, there was this agreement that Abram just sort of referenced that, yes, countries are going to put in money into this fund. The idea was that by 2020, there would be $100 billion a year available to global south countries. And that has not happened. No one has actually lived up to this promise. And there's a lot of, I feel like it comes up at COP almost every year, and global south countries are getting justifiably so, more and more pissed at every conference, because the U.S. and other countries like to kick this problem down the road. Mm-hmm. Abram, please jump in here if I'm getting any of this wrong, or clarify. Yeah.
You're doing a great job. Yeah, I think something like 19 billion of that 100 billion has ever been dispersed, and then it's been split between 70 odd countries around the world. So its impact has really been minimal. And yeah, you're exactly right. It's just this incredible unfairness tied to the reason that the costs are mounting in the first place. The reason, in the case of the Caribbean, why the debt is mounting in the first place. Really, a substantial portion of it isn't their fault at all.
Yeah. You know, we have this like running, it's not even a joke, but like this running theme on the show where like Amy will explain something about how the fossil fuel industry works and I'll be like, oh, that's sharecropping. And as we're going through, as we're going through all of this debt and how these financial institutions are set up, it's like, oh, that's just colonialism with extra steps.
Exactly.
So, like, we often talk about how climate change was caused by colonialism. And while that's true, it's also still being propped up by this type of climate colonialism, right?
That's exactly right. And so that was a theme in what I wrote, but it was also, it was a theme that emerged for Mia Motley through the course of my reporting. And it was really interesting for me to watch, not that I can pretend to be in her head or suggest that this wasn't a strong feeling for her at the outset. But over the course of the year that I reported this story, she gave a number of those speeches that we talked about, and she was rebuffed a number of times. And the overall situation in the world and with the COP summit and the response to the demand for better funding and financial recognition was all negative. Everything kind of went in the wrong direction, and she just got increasingly frustrated and began to see the system for what you just described, which is that it was just yet again, it wasn't a system that she was supposed to use and could use to climb out of her own debt hole, but it was actually the same old oppression, that her island and her people and, and the generations before her had been, coping with for 200 years on Barbados, just in a different form. Whatever wealth they had would be extracted in one form or another.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any sense of how this will come up in the next COP in Cairo? What are you kind of keeping an eye out for there?
So it came up so prominently in Glasgow, more so than many people expected, or at least, up until, the immediate buildup. And it was a robust conversation, and there was great hope at that moment. And Mia Motley was a part of that conversation, gave a significant speech there. So that was a moment of hope and greater attention to these issues than had been paid before in that forum. And then virtually, nothing happened after that. I've heard a lot of kind of cynicism about what happens next in Egypt. And, the general expectation is that it will come up again. The conversation has gotten a little more sophisticated. The media coverage, including my piece, but lots of pieces have, brought more attention to the needs. And so that conversation might go further, in Egypt than it has so far, but there's, real tempered expectations about what might result from it.
Mm-hmm. Amy, I'm going to ask you to answer your own question because I know you've been thinking about it. What are you looking for in Cairo?
Oh, I have basically the same answer. Yeah, I think I just don't know. Although I do wonder how much a lot of the, extreme weather events we're seeing
all year long,
all summer long. Not, all over the place.
Yeah.
All year long. But especially this summer, I feel like it's been quite intense and really like everywhere all at once in a way that I'm not sure I remember seeing. It makes me wonder if that will have an impact on these conversations one way or the other. Like, will all of the heat waves in Europe make European countries go, well, we're having our own big climate impacts that we need to pay for? I don't know.
Well, I think that's just it. And that, that's a theme, or at least an anecdotal comment that would come up repeatedly, through the course of my reporting, which boils down to the sort of sad reality that most countries, most citizens of most wealthier countries just aren't interested in paying this tab. And as long as they're not, it's unlikely to get paid, no matter how many economists say that the numbers can work out and that it's the right thing to do. And the fact that there's more storms and more shocks in our country and across Europe is only increasing the sense locally in those places that they have enough to pay for. There's a bit of a backlash against foreign aid in general, a less and less desire to, send national money abroad. And, I think that that's going to continue to be a huge headwind on, loss and damage kind of compensation as well.
No question, just a big old sigh.
Sorry. It's true.
One of the most frustrating assumptions in climate policy and just in climate conversations is that the environment has to take a backseat to the economy. And your story talked a lot about how our financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank don't take climate into consideration at all or even think it's their problem. That is kind of part of the story that surprised me the most. What part of the investigation surprised you the most?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, because it seems so obvious to me, right? I mean, the return on investment for, paying for infrastructure in countries in the Caribbean that protects them against climate change in the context of the debt and the cost of these storms is something like 6 to 8 times. So, I don't think that there's a strong moral argument, to this whole issue. But if you want to approach it on a strictly economic level, it pencils out. The more you pay for these things up front, or you provide the money to pay for them up front, the less draw there is on foreign aid in the future, the less greater expense there is, the less losses there are by Wall Street banks and so forth. So it seems to make sense to do that. And the IMF especially has just been very, very slow to recognize that these economies work that way. The World Bank is a little different. It's a mixed bag, and it needs to do a lot more, but it has, it now has robust climate programs and climate policies, but they're not effectively fixing the problems that we're talking about yet. The IMF just doesn't have that at all. And so when a country like Grenada or Barbados is in, fiscal dire straits, the IMF goes in and basically is like their doctor and gives them a workup and says, here's everything you're doing wrong, here's everything you're doing right, here's how you can balance your balance sheet. You need to sell off your airport and fire 1,000 employees and raise taxes, and if you do all those things, then your balance sheet will work out. And that's the way they've always done it, and that's the way they're still doing it. And what they're completely failing to do, even as they increasingly pay lip service to how important climate change is and how important equity around the fiscal side of climate change is, they're still not calculating in the future costs of climate change when they decide what makes an economy healthy, and they're not making sure that countries can set aside the money to pay for that or can get the inexpensive loans from the IMF or elsewhere to pay for it. So they keep kind of trying to write a country's balance sheet and leave it just as vulnerable to climate change as it would have been before it had fiscal problems in the first place.
Yeah, well, I know a lot of these oil companies are mad that the financial industry is becoming really climate woke.
That's a whole new thing.
Which of course is bullshit. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what the oil companies are getting up to after this ad break. Now a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. When you're faced with challenges in life, it can be tough to train your brain to stay in problem-solving mode. Yeah, because you're in fight or flight mode. But when you, seriously, when you learn how to find your own solutions, there's no better feeling. A therapist can help you become a better problem solver, making it easier to accomplish your goals no matter how big or small, and I can attest to that. While I might focus on my problems, it's because, I like to think my problems through, but sometimes I will get stuck in thinking the problems through and be like, what, I'll solve that bitch tomorrow. And then we're going again in the morning. If you're thinking of giving therapy a try, and you should be, BetterHelp is a great option. It's convenient, accessible, affordable, and entirely online. Amy, I know you love that.
I do love it. It makes it, I find it impossible to fit therapy into my schedule without this option. Actually, it's just like I can't go during work hours. I don't want to pay for childcare and therapy at the same time. I just I just refuse. And so yes, this is the only way that I can go to therapy is with BetterHelp. So big thumbs up from me.
Yep.
And probably everyone I deal with.
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm sure there are a lot of people who can relate to that struggle, especially here in the pandemic. You don't even have to like worry about risking your health to go see your therapist. And you can also, match with different therapists, because BetterHelp will match you with a therapist after you fill out a brief online survey. And you can switch therapists at any time. So when you want to be a better problem solver, therapy can get you there. Visit betterhelp.com/hottake today to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp.com/hottake.
Support for Hot Take comes from the Southern Environmental Law Center and its podcast, Broken Ground. In the latest season, listeners journey to Boxtown, Tennessee, a Black neighborhood on the edge of Memphis, tucked into a bend of the Mississippi River. This community has a rich history, and its residents cherish their deep ties to the land. Here, people young and old, hailing from all corners of the city and beyond, came together to fight the environmental injustices and threats to their quality of life posed by a controversial crude oil pipeline. In the course of telling this story, Broken Ground uncovers the stories of the community who pushed back against the project through grassroots organizing, legal advocacy, and unwavering determination. Find out how a crude oil pipeline went from imminent to canceled from the people on the front lines. Listen to their story in the latest season, now available wherever you get your podcasts, or stream it directly at brokengroundpodcast.org. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit, Abram, about this kind of other side of this, which is that some of the countries that are in a similar predicament as Barbados, where they're heavily leveraged and they're probably going to experience some very expensive climate impacts, are dealing with that problem in another way, which is making deals with oil companies to drill for oil. So this is kind of what's happening to a lot of the countries that have either gas or oil resources, is they're in this real bind where they're fully aware of the fact that drilling more oil will exacerbate this problem, but they have this immediate debt that needs to be dealt with. So I don't know. I don't know if you've looked at that or have any thoughts about it in general. I've been working on a story about Guyana for a long time, so I'm sort of down the rabbit hole on this. And the World Bank is very involved in that too, because at a certain point they were really kind of encouraging fossil fuel development as one type of economic development. So yeah, I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, so I am sure I don't know a tenth as much about it as you do, and I have not gone down that rabbit hole. So I'm only sort of generally cognizant, except to say that as you pointed out, like these countries are in the crucible, right? Yeah. They need the money, and they don't have any other way to get the money but to kind of serve this master of the oil, the oil companies, and it's terrible, and yet I'm not sure that we should expect anything different without some other kind of outside engagement or interference in that system. And this is exactly where this is the wrong place for the World Bank to be. And when the World Bank supports projects like that, and I know they do in a number of cases, it runs counter to what they say about climate change and about the need for countries to adapt around the world, and it's just not helping. And it tends to undermine whatever else they do to help countries around the world adapt to climate change. And I think that the way to look at it is sort of similar to the way that we're starting to look at efforts to save the Amazon. Do you compensate Brazil for not cutting down trees?
Right.
And I think that we need to consider compensating other countries that have valuable resources for not mining those resources, if that's the only way that they can produce revenues, if that's what's important to us, to the rest of the world.
Yeah Well, and that's been I think it was in, I want to say 2007 in Ecuador. The president at the time, Rafael Correa, had this idea, right, of asking the world to pay Ecuador not to drill oil in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And it got so much press. Everyone was like, what an amazing idea. Bravo. Yes, this is a thing that we should do. And then, he was asking for $3.6 billion. And I think by 2013 it had about 200 million, which is pretty good, percentage wise compared to the loss and damages stuff. But still not enough to, to justify. So I think they kind of went with this half measure of like keeping some of it in the ground, but allowing drilling in other parts. And I was just talking to a guy in Guyana who was like, yeah, we would love it if someone would pay us to not drill this oil. But if we don't do it, then Venezuela is probably going to do it. And they're taking these contracts with these oil companies that, of course, are not great for the countries in question. Like these countries are not going to end up making it rich off of oil,
They'll lose almost all of the profit from doing that.
They'll lose. Exactly. So it's really, but they're like, well, this might give us enough in the short term. And there again, Guyana is looking at oil money as a way to pay down enough debt to free up enough of their GDP to build roads and build schools and, make the country somewhat resilient to climate disasters. And it's just this kind of constant trap that I think your story did such a good job of outlining, but that I think it'd be great if more folks in countries like ours and European countries were aware of and like cared enough about to kind of push for loss and damages.
Yeah, and this is where I know you want to stay on oil, which is more interesting anyway. But this is where Mia Motley arrives at, right? By like March of this year, is this conclusion that the economic system just doesn't work, that you can't use, this whole hope of producing a product, selling a product for market value to slowly scrape out of your hole of debt, whether you're Guyana or Barbados. It just, the system is all set up against you and it will never work. And the only thing that will begin to work is, to try to envision a totally different way of covering the expenses of these parts of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. What this really underscores to me is that climate reparations really are the ultimate climate solution. And I think it kind of, people kind of dismiss it as like this, you're just doing it because it's the right thing to do, as though that's a bad reason to do something.
Right.
But it also, right. But it's also like, if I have all of this oil and the only way I can support myself is by selling that oil or by going further into debt, like climate reparations really does emerge as the solution to it. It's as the solution to a problem caused by slavery and colonialism. I hope actually that's what we hear more of in Cairo. I know it's come up a lot at different COPs, but like I want to hear people talk more full-throatedly and not just folks from the global south about the need for climate reparations. And it's not an accident that the people who deserve slavery reparations and colonial reparations are the exact same people who need climate reparations. And it seems like debt forgiveness would be a good first step toward it.
Yeah. Totally. Well, and to your point earlier, Bram, like it makes financial sense too. If you don't care about doing the right thing, which you should, but like if you don't, it does make financial sense too, because these are all of these issues are going to cause major migration and refugee crises, which is something that you've covered extensively in the past too. So it's going to I don't know. It's like the idea that you can be part of a global market, but not actually have any of the impacts that happen when everything is connected globally it's way more foolish and nonsensical than the idea of climate reparations.
Yeah, and I think that's really the ultimate consequence that's kind of hanging out there, but that the world's been slow to recognize is it is still this sort of fantasy of a globalized world to think that everything around the planet stays separate. That we can draw these profits from far, far away, and we can use the resources of another country far, far away and colonialize those places. But the impacts of that stay far, far away. And migration is going to change that. And, the Caribbean is adjacent to the United States and, is a potential source of great migration. The influx of people that Europe can expect out of North Africa, is just enormous. And the costs of that destabilization or addressing that migration one way or another, not all of which maybe will be negative, but the costs will be enormous, and they will probably exceed, by many times what it might have taken to pay those reparations now or to pay down those debts now in a way that would help stabilize those places.
Yeah. I really loved your series. I think it was in ProPublica and the New York Times about climate immigration. It was like a 5-part story. Yeah, really, really, really good work. And we're planning to do a deeper dive on climate immigration in the future. Climate colonialism can be a big, big driver of that. And one of the most haunting things about that series was the final story about the one place that will actually improve with climate change. Can you talk a little bit about where that is and why?
Yeah, I wrote that story about Russia. And, and the premise of that story, or the case study of it, was that, that Russia's environment and potentially Russia's economy would improve as the climate warmed. But what the research actually says is that all sorts of northern countries and economies will improve. So Canada and Finland and Norway, and Russia among them. But, what Russia has that the rest of the world does not is enormous land resources, an incredible ability to produce food. It's already the largest grain producer in the world, and not a lot of people. So not that Russians want a lot of outsiders moving in, but the Russian landmass has the capacity to absorb and even take advantage of a great number of migrants should that kind of northern migration happen. In the case of Russia, it would be out of South Asia largely, but that they can capitalize on that. It takes human capital and population to grow an economy. But there's some research out of Stanford University, Marshall Burke, that's looked at the economic growth potential for northern countries, and it's dependent on having the population to support the economic growth. But his models basically say that by late in the century, the Russian economy could grow by 400%. The Canadian economy could grow by 250% due to climate factors alone. As the benefits of living in a northern and colder climate, shift their way.
Mm. And the odds of, like you alluded to, the odds of Russia taking in a ton of climate refugees, not super high.
Well, in the present, Russians are not very welcoming, tend to be racist is a strong word, but it came up a lot in my reporting. They really don't like outsiders.
Might be accurate.
But that can all change over the decades as the great need for people to settle land and to turn it into arable land and to produce crops on it and make industry. As those needs get greater and greater. I mean, the Russian population is shrinking. The demographic trends are not positive, so they will need more people if they want to meet those other objectives.
Yikes. So, what's Russian for great replacement theory? No, I'm just kidding. Yikes. I mean, yeah, this is the thing too, is that like this, I don't know. I feel like there's like a very clear, like smart and preventative way to deal with this. And it is climate reparations and helping, the entire world prepare for this. And there is a very short-sighted and horrific way. And I just don't want to think about it right this minute, but we're gonna, yeah. It's like you say all the time, Mary, it's like what people and especially white people will do as all of these impacts come to bear.
Well, for me, it comes back to the IMF a little bit, just to bring it full circle, because the IMF because of how it was formed and how its members work, has these incredible reserve, at its disposal, or at least, under its sway. So, something like $12.5 trillion now. And, one of very smart economists that I talked to who works for the government of Barbados with Mia Motley, is pitching a whole sort of series of solutions that seem to have legs that are basically use the IMF's resources as a way to pay those reparations that we're talking about. And it might not quite be as much as, as an actual giveaway, as an actual reparation, but the idea is to harness this incredible sum of money, $12 trillion that lies outside of a sovereign account and is not controlled by any one, independent and selfish government, and use that, for the IMF's mission, but designate it, for some climate good and to be able to improve the resiliency of the countries that we're talking about in the ways that we're talking about. So there's there's the invention of new mechanisms and ideas, and I think these will come up, at the next COP summit as well. It's not like the world is at a total loss for what to do. It's just a question of, if some of these ideas can get any traction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I feel like that's a good place to end. Kind of a hopeful idea, Abram. Thank you for that.
Yeah, we don't get a lot of those on this show.
It's absolutely
we went down
what
deep.
They
it's
should
nice
do.
To climb out of tiny.
Yeah, thank you for that. We don't get a lot of hopeful moments here on Hot Take. So, and I mean, we're not scared to go to the dark places. Whatever.
It's true. Thank you for going there with us. And yeah, we'll link to your Barbados story and all of your other great work. And we, appreciate all of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for talking about this, and thanks for being interested in my work. And I really appreciate yours as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hot Take is a Crooked Media production.
It's produced by Ray Pang and mixed and edited by Jules Bradley. Our music is by Vasilis Fotopoulos. Thamali Kodakara is our consulting producer. And our executive producers are Mary Anais Hegler, Michael Martinez, and me, Amy Westervelt.
Special thanks to Sandy Gerard, Ari Schwartz, Kyle Seglin, and Charlotte Landis for production support, and to Amelia Montooth for digital support.
You can follow the show on Twitter @RealHotTake, sign up for our newsletter at hottakepod.com, and subscribe to Crooked Media's video channel at youtube.com/crookedmedia.